pay that out at the beginning. So the eagle-eyed of you reading the report will see that actually we'd said there were 9 school inspections. I think because we'd reported to 9 in the last report, actually there are more. There were an additional 2 that were in the summer since the last report. So that makes 11 in total during the summer. 8 of those were Section 8, and then there were 3 Section 5s. And then so far this autumn term, bearing in mind that we haven't got to the end of it, we've had 6 inspections to date. 1 of those was a Section 8 and 5 Section 5s that are full inspections, the graded ones. So you can see actually it appears in Portsmouth that there's been an emphasis of a change from Ofsted, and there are more full graded inspections actually being undertaken than the ungraded ones where the grade can't actually change unless it's converted at that particular moment in time. So the table lays out about whether the schools from those Section 8s continue to be good, whether if it's a whole graded one for the overall effectiveness, whether the judgment has changed, whether it's good, outstanding, or if they've moved to a different judgment for overall effectiveness. So the bullet points there then talk about some of the individual schools. So St Edmunds had a Section 8, retained its outstanding judgment, while St John's, who were outstanding, had a full Section 5 and moved from that outstanding overall effectiveness to good. But they did get good outstanding in some of those categories, so the behaviour and attitudes, personal development and early years, but their overall effectiveness was judged to be good. And that inspection was led by a senior HMI, so very, very focused. And then we've had a bit of a sort of swapping around. So we've had some schools that have gone from requires improvement and they've had a full graded inspection and moved to good, like Castleview and Westover, whilst 2 of our other schools have gone the other way round. They've moved from good to requires improvement. So you can see there's a little bit of changing around. And then another school, King's Academy Northern Parade Junior, the actual overall effectiveness judgment hasn't changed, but because it was an ungraded one, what was known for that Section 8, it was known as what's known as an outcome 3. So had it been a full inspection, it might not have stayed good. Therefore, it says when its next inspection's got to be. So there's been a lot of inspecting going on. And for Ofsted, they've committed that all schools between May 21 and July 25 will be inspected, because obviously because of the pandemic, they built in that extension of often up to 6 terms. So we've laid out there how that sort of speeding up and how that inspection process is now, the timescales of it is changing. And also to bear in mind all of those outstanding schools that were taken out of the framework are now back in this framework. So some of those schools that hadn't been inspected since, like Neon Infant, since 2009 have just recently been inspected. And obviously on the table it shows that actually some of the reports aren't in yet, so we're awaiting those.
Brilliant, Debbie, thank you so much. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. I don't think I need to really add anything to that. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything or got any questions. I'm assuming not. It's a standard report which just describes the activity and the outcomes. I suppose it does show that the resource has been invested at a central government level to actually go ahead and achieve what they said that they were going to do in terms of getting around to all schools. It very much looks like that, doesn't it? With the speed at which it's happening. Okay, so the next item is item 6, and that is Portsmouth data for 2022, and I believe Mike is leading this.
Yeah, and it might be, I know you've got a copy of the report, but it might be useful if I just share the presentation, so it just helps me then go through each slide, and it'll be fairly brief, but if I just bring that up, just bear with me. Hopefully you can see that.
We can, Mike, thank you.
Good, okay. Right, so I'll just run through this. So yeah, these are headlines of the data from 2022. And there are some caveats, and I'll come on to those later. But just a bit of background, and you've heard this kind of scenario before. So we talk about the Portsmouth paradox, the fact that most of our schools are good or better, which does reflect the good quality of education and inclusive practice in classrooms across our schools. But if we look at outcomes at the end of Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 4, we are well below where we need to be, and in the bottom decile nationally for most performance measures. And as we go through the 2022 data, what is clear is that hasn't changed. And in fact, what you will see is the gap between ourselves and national has, across a number of measures, widened. So that paradox still firmly remains, but in fact the picture is probably a little bit more worrying based on 2022 data, but there are caveats which I'll come on to in a moment. That's a bit of context, just in terms of the education landscape, the number of schools that are in maths, numbers of pupils on roll, a bit about deprivation. So I won't go through all of that, but it's just a bit of context there for you. The caveat is DFE themselves have advised on caution when comparing schools' performance in 21-22 with the last set of sort of validated results before we'd had to go through teacher assessed results back in 2019, and making those comparisons with national and LA averages. I've done some of that comparison in this presentation, but as I say, you've got to be really cautious about that, and that's because of the uneven impact the pandemic had on pupils and schools across the country, and that's particularly the case in Portsmouth. We saw a very uneven distribution. We know that some schools were really badly affected last year due to staff absence, for example, as well as pupil absence as a result of the pandemic, and obviously the impact of the pandemic before then. So yeah, a lot of caution with these results, but nevertheless, I think it's important we share them with you. So I'll just start with primary, and starting with a year 1 phonics screening check, which we do. And these are the figures for 2022, and as is the case across the country, those figures have dipped, and we saw a significant dip in Portsmouth down to 67% of the expected standard, and you can see that gap between ourselves and national being the red line, has increased. One thing just worth commenting on, as I go through these slides, what you will have seen previously up to 2019 was generally a trajectory of improvement where we were either closing the gap on national or at least keeping it fairly stable. What we see in these 22 figures is obviously a significant dip, as we've seen across the country, but in most cases a widening of that gap between ourselves and national. Then we go on to Key Stage 1 reading, and there again you see that dip down from 73 to 63% expected, and that gap between ourselves and national widening. Writing similar, down to 50%, and maths again a dip there, down to 63%, although the gap there is not so wide. That's at Key Stage 1. If we go on to Key Stage 2, this is the combined score for reading, writing, maths at expected standard. That dropped from 58% to 48%, so a 10 percentage point drop compared to the 2019 figures. And you can see there a slight widening of the gap between ourselves and national. There are some positive stories in here, so I'll start with the most positive one. And this, I think, reflects some of the work that Debbie was referring to earlier. And this is around Key Stage 2 reading, where, in fact, the figure was increased from 67% back in 2019 up to 70%, and you can see we've actually closed the gap between ourselves and national. That was really positive, and we are hoping that will continue into next year, of course. Less positive is writing, which we saw across all our schools. Actually, this was not so uneven, and there you can see the gap widening between ourselves and national. And maths was a concern. Again, we've been on a trajectory of improvement, so we'd got up to 75% in 2019. We're down at 63% in 2022. So those were the key headlines from primary. Just talking about GCSE figures, and again, these are provisional still, but again, a bit of caution here in terms of these figures. We've just there given some background about the fact that exams were cancelled in 2020 and 21 due to the pandemic, and of course we awarded teacher assessed grades for those years, and those results are certainly not comparable. The results in 2022, worth just noting that Ofqual announced that the approach the exam boards would be taking in 2022 would reflect a midpoint between the summer of 2019 and summer of 21, and results in summer 22 would therefore be higher when the summer exams were last sat in 2019, but no lower than 21. So you need to bear that in mind in terms of these results, which we were expecting to be higher as a result of that announcement. So these are the results for 2022, the headlines, and we have provided a comparison to 2019, and we saw significant increases in terms of the standard pass in both English and maths, and there you've got that figure of 61%, and then the single figures for English and maths, 72 and 65 respectively. And then we look at the strong pass, which is grade 5 and above, and there again we've made significant increases, even more so in terms of the strong passes, English and maths at 41%, and then English 57%, maths at 47%. So that was pleasing to see, but as you'll see later on, if you compare this to national, that gap looks to have widened. So let's just have a look at the standard pass in English and maths. So those are you've got the trend data there from 2016 to 2019, where you were seeing a slight decline. In 2022, again, with all the caveats I've just mentioned, and the fact that these results will be probably higher than what they will be next year, we're at 61%, and there you've got the national figure at 69%. So that gap has clearly, actually it hasn't widened that much, to be honest, but it is still a fairly wide gap. And if we go on to the next one, so strong pass in English and maths, as I say, we're down at 41%, but that's an increase from 2019. We've seen similar increases across the country, the national figure at 50%. So that gap has slightly widened in terms of English and maths strong pass. Average attainment 8 score we've given there, again an increase there, we're up to 43.2. The national is 48.8, so again, a fair gap there. It's a similar gap to where we were in 2019, and progress 8 score we're now at minus 0.35. That's an improvement on 2019, and the national is at minus 0.13, and there you can we have actually narrowed that gap between ourselves and national. So those were the headlines for GCSE performance. Just a few other headlines worth just reflecting on. As you know, we track post-16 participation, 16 and 17-year-olds, and there we have given the NEET percentages. So those young people who are not in education, employment and training. There's an overall figure that's calculated which takes into account the NEET figure and also the percentage of unknowns. So our overall figure is 5.2%. If we just take the NEET figure, it's 3.8%, which is above national, where you would expect that to be, given the challenges within Portsmouth. But we're slightly above our stat neighbours. But that figure has come down significantly from where we were a number of years ago, and our unknowns is still very low, because we robustly track our young people across Portsmouth, and therefore that NEET figure 3.8% is a very accurate figure, whereas other local authorities who have higher levels of unknowns, their NEET figures are perhaps a little bit shaky, whereas we can have complete confidence in ours. Attendance obviously is something we track, and I've just given the national data here, which the last set of sort of national data from the autumn and spring terms from 21-22. All of that was up because of the pandemic and because of the significant absence that we were seeing across the country. Overall absence there at 8.1% for the city council, for the local authority area, national 7.3%. Persistent absence, which is a concern, was at 24%. Just above national. that has come down significantly, and the data we get from live data to the study bugs data that we have is showing a significant improvement on those figures. But that's obviously being replicated across the country, and we'll be reviewing that very closely as we go forward this year in terms of our attendance strategy. And I think that probably covers it. So that is a very brief run through the data from 2022 with all the caveats that I've just mentioned.
Thank you, Mike. That's very detailed, and I think is very stark in the presentation of it. I think really the next year or two is going to really put the proper context on stuff. In many ways, as you've kind of alluded to, that we were beginning to close some gaps, but we are, a poor city which was impacted by the pandemic, and therefore it's not surprising that some of those impacts seem to be showing through. However, there are where we seem to have focused, and like I go back to the kind of the reading focus that we specifically decided that we were going to prioritize. There's some really positive results there. So yes, more work to do. We know that.
We're not a priority education investment area for nothing.
I was about to say that. I'm sure we're going to come on to that for the last report. But just before we do that, is there anyone who wants to make any further comment or ask any questions of it? I think it was very thorough and very explicit in terms of the data, which is what it said on the tin. So thank you for that report. I mean, it's duly noted, and that leads us on nicely as you segued yourself into the final report, which is yes, based on that, it's no surprise that we have been identified as a priority education investment area, and I know a lot of work has gone on to putting up the plans for that, so I shall hand back to you.
Yep. Okay, so I'll just take you through the report and just highlight key aspects of this report and give you a latest update in terms of where we are, because when we wrote this report, this was prior to the meeting of the PEP Strategic Board. We've since had that meeting and we've since submitted the delivery plan, so I will just give a brief update on where we are currently. So in terms of background...
Can I just say you're still sharing your other screen?
Oh, am I?
Yeah.
Right, I apologise. I will stop
That's
sharing.
okay. Just
yeah, no, thank you for pointing out. I thought I'd got rid of it. Is that gone now?
Yes, it has.
I can't see that on my screen, so it doesn't doesn't show. Right, okay, I'll go back to the report. So a bit of background. So in the Levelling Up White Paper back in February 22, the government identified 55 education investment areas, and we were one of those. They then subsequently, when the White Paper was released in March 2022, identified 24 priority areas from those 55. And that included the existing opportunity areas, which have been going for 3 years or so. There are 12 of those, and then 12 new priority education investment areas, of which we were one of those. And in fact, we're the only one in terms of a new education investment area in the southeast. The only other that exists, which is an opportunity area, is Hastings. So spotlight very much on us. I've included there the government's ambition by 2030 in terms of what the white paper said, which is incredibly ambitious given the figures I've just presented. So 90% of pupils meeting the expected standard in reading, writing and maths combined at Key Stage 2. And bear in mind where we are, we're below 50, so that is that's quite a challenge. And then also the national GCSE average grade in both English and language and in maths increasing from 4.5 to 5. Those are the targets the government has set. The government has allocated, as well as focusing on those priority education investment areas in terms of many of the government programs that currently exist, so giving these areas higher priority and therefore greater levels of eligibility. They've also allocated some additional funding, £42 million in total, to address local needs in those areas. And that provides for bespoke interventions which meet local need. They have to be, in the DFC's words, sort of evidence-based, so that it's clear that what we're proposing has the potential to have impact. but it is meant to be bespoke and local. So that was welcome. But there's a process behind this to try and access this funding, which has been onerous to say the least. So the process, the first thing we need to do is set up a local partnership board to act in an advisory capacity. Well, we were already there in that respect because we've got the Portsmouth Education Partnership Board, which has been going for some time now, and we have a very strong structure sitting behind that. So we put forward that we wanted to use that mechanism, and we adapted our terms of reference to fit with the requirements of the local partnership boards, and that was accepted by the DFE. We then also, underneath that board, set up a subgroup with representatives from across the board. That included Matt, the Teaching School Hub, Diocese, and the local authority. And that board was tasked, that group was tasked with three key areas of work. First was a data-led analysis to look at what the key issues were, and that reflects some of the data I've presented earlier. From that, we had to then identify 3 to 4 local improvement priorities, which we completed, and I'll come on to that in a moment. And then from that, we had to start to work up a delivery plan, which included all those interventions I've just referred to. And we had to demonstrate that those interventions would directly impact on the key requirements the DFE were looking for, which is around improved attainment and progress, particularly at the end of Key Stage 2 and at the end of Key Stage 4. And that delivery plan had to be submitted by the end of November. Well, in fact, it had to be submitted last Tuesday. So that was the task ahead of us, a very tight timetable. And it's fair to say when we started this task, we didn't know what the budget was. We didn't really know what the guidance was. So we were working slightly blind. And over the course of the last 2 or 3 months, we've had guidance being drip fed to us, sometimes conflicting guidance, which has been a challenge, I think it's fair to say. But we've risen to it and we've delivered. And as I say, we've just submitted that delivery plan. Just to clarify what the 4 local improvement priorities are, and that was agreed. So the first one was around early communication, language and literacy, and this is one of our priorities of the PEP strategy, which we've been working on, and obviously we've just heard about some of the positive impacts that's had around reading. The second priority was around maths. Now that hasn't been a priority which has appeared in our education strategy for the last 3 years, partly because we were on a very strong trajectory of improvement, and we had seen some significant investment through the Solent Maths Hub around this priority. So it wasn't felt in the past to be something which should feature strongly within our education strategy. But given the results we've seen more recently, and given how important maths is in terms of pupils' progress and access to post-16, we felt we needed to reinstate that as a priority. So that is our second priority. Our third one, no surprises here, is around school attendance, and obviously we already have a strategy in place to improve school attendance and reduce suspensions. And our fourth one, which overlaps with the other 3, is around work that will focus on particular underperforming groups, and that included children eligible for free school meals, so our disadvantaged children, boys, but particularly white British boys, and pupils with SEND, particularly those pupils who are in mainstream and who are on SEN support. We know those groups underperform, particularly when you compare that with their peers and with national averages. So those are the 4 priorities we took forward. Over the last month or so, we've been working on the delivery plan, and this has been a significant piece of work. And the original guidance was asking for quite a lot of detail, and we set that out. We've had many conversations. The subgroup has kind of split into 4, working on those 4 priorities. We've had lots of discussions with some of the key partners that will be delivering some of those interventions, and we got to the point on Tuesday where we were able to submit that final plan. I'd like to be able to tell you what's going to happen next in terms of when we will get the green light, when we can access that funding, etc., but I can't tell you that because that's still not clear. All I have been told by the DFE and the Regions Group is those plans now are going to be submitted. It won't be the detailed plan that will be submitted to ministers. What they're going to be doing is extracting from our plan the headlines and the costs, and that will be going forward to ministers over the course of the next few weeks. I hope that before Christmas we will get some feedback on that delivery plan, so we are in a position to start implementation from January. But I don't know is the short answer. I think that just about covers the summary. I'm very happy to share with board members the copy of the delivery plan now, because that has now gone. But I suppose the caveat to that is there could be further iterations depending on the feedback we get.
Thanks, Mike. I just got one question that I'm checking. So the money is for 3 years, and we're halfway through year 1, and we don't know about the money.
Correct.
Just checking.
Yeah.
Okay. It'll be interesting to know when we do get it.
Yeah.
And presumably, if it comes towards the end of the first year, you'll still have that money. They won't. Will they extend it for?
They haven't said that yet. All they've said so far is that the money is confirmed. It's not going to be taken away. I mean, that was a worry, given the political turmoil we've seen and the changes in government. I mean, and the autumn statement, we were concerned that funding would disappear, but we've had confirmation that's in there. The Treasury won't be taking that back. So, but we've had no other guidance around whether there would be any sort of form of extension. At the moment, they're working on the basis of those 3 years and the fact that we're nearly halfway through the first.
Yeah, no, I was just the reason I make that point here in this forum is because I've seen obviously the detail of the submission, and there's a lot of hoops to jump through and detail to work through. So if you're asked to cost particular schemes of work, which are going to be done over a period of time, if the money suddenly comes through in May, you can't then teach a year's worth of whatever it is that you plan to do in the last few weeks of term. It's just not practicable. So on the one hand, it's about keeping the money, and we all know that money's lovely to have. But actually, if you've gone to the extent that we have in saying this is how it's going to be spent over a 10-week intervention program or whatever it is, you can't just suddenly forget the timeline, can you? So I'll be following this one with curiosity, even though there's a promise that we'll keep the money. But thank you. And
I think you make a fair point, because if it does take a long time before we get that money coming through, then I think we've got a pretty good case to say, look, we can't do that over just 2 years now. Could we then run into a third year? So I'm sure there's a lot more discussion to follow. Sure. But
and the reason I highlight that is actually that's the only way to do it properly if you really care about the outcomes of children. If you just care about ticking a box to say we gave that money to that education, the money's gone in, I mean, that's a whole different thing, isn't it? If we genuinely want to make long-term impacts, then we have to do it in the most professional way we know how to do it. Anyway, as you say, you and the officers have done, and the other people who on the PEP have done a really good job at thinking this through in great detail. And we have to be grateful that we've got this injection of money, and we'll do the best we can with it for kids in the city. So thank you to you and your team for doing that. Does anyone else want to add anything to that report? Helen, you don't want to say anything? All right. Yeah, I can see you nodding and stuff on the most important points. So that's that, and I think that's the last item on the agenda, except to say that the next meeting is, I've got to find it on my phone again now. Can you help me, Anna? I did just read it.
It's the 2nd of March. Just double check.
Thursday, the 2nd of March at 4 p.m. And I know there's only Helen here who's not an officer, but I'm assuming we're still happy to do these. We don't have to do them in person for the
as far as we know, this could still continue virtually unless there's any change.
Happy to continue it virtually? I am. Okay. All right then. I think that can be a decision that's made. All right. Thank you very much to everyone who's attended. You have over an hour back I'm sure everyone will dive into their emails. Thank you very much. Anna, you can turn it off now, the live
Well, okay, I'll do
stream.
that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Susie.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks,
Bye.
Helen. Thanks
Bye.
everyone for coming.
Thank you.